All right, this is Lecture 6. This lecture I'll talk about research methods that are typically used in communication research, specifically mass media research. The common methods that I talked about at the end of last lecture were content analysis, experiment, field experiments, surveys, and meta-analysis. I'll go through each one of these, talk about what they're good for, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and what you can find out. Because the questions that you want to ask, the question that a media researcher will want to ask, uh, are not answered by all forms of research equally well. Some forms are better at answering specific questions and specific types of questions than others. So the first method is content analysis. This assesses basically what is being presented in the media. If you think back to our question that we asked before, who says what to whom, through which channel, with what effect, this is the what question. So it's designed to answer what is in content. What does the content look like? And you can quantify your content based on this method. Now, content analysis is purely descriptive, which means there's no evidence of media effects whatsoever. So a question you might want to ask, or a researcher might want to ask, might sound something like this. How much violence is in children's cartoons? Now that's a question that is basically just designed to look at how much of one specific type of action is present in children's cartoons. They're trying to answer how much violence. And now it doesn't tell you anything about what will happen if children are exposed to violent cartoons. It doesn't say that children being exposed to violent cartoons will act aggressively or anything like that. The question itself is just looking at how much violence is in children's cartoons. So you can't make evidence, or you can't make arguments based on effects off of this type of analysis, but it can tell you exactly how much of information is there. Now this is basically how you do this. We'll look at that question that I just asked, how much violence is in children's cartoons. And first off, you select your sample. So we want to know how much violence is in children's cartoons. Well, to select my sample, I might want to figure out, well, what are children's cartoons? How do I define that? And so I would try to look at coming up with a definition that defines what a children's cartoon is. There are lots of cartoons, right? So like Family Guy is a cartoon, but would I consider that a children's cartoon or not? Well, probably not. So you would have to base your definition and select your sample based on what you're interested in. So if I'm interested in children's cartoons, maybe I only look at cartoons that are aired between 8 a.m. in the morning and 7 p.m. at night, because that's when most children's cartoons are aired. So I can look at that, and I can restrict myself to specific channels, right? I can restrict myself to ABC, CBS, NBC, and the Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon, and exclude other channels like Fox, which tends to have more adult-driven cartoons. So after you select your sample, then you need to train coders on what you're looking for. So you have to come up with definitions not only of children's cartoons, but also what you mean by violence. And you also have to figure out a way to train your coders so that they see the same thing. So for example, let's say we're watching Tom and Jerry, and Tom hits Jerry over the head with a sledgehammer 50 times. Does that count as one act of violence, or does that count as 50 separate acts of violence? So you have to come up with a definition that meets your criteria and that you think makes sense. You then trade your coders based on this definition, and the coders assign components of messages to specific categories, right? So they're looking for those acts of violence. So you can code for comedy, you can code for violence, you can code for other categories, but content analysis only tells us how much, the frequency or magnitude of something we have. It tells us also how content can differ, right? So if we know how much violence is in one specific type of content, maybe children's cartoons, we can compare that with how much violence is in adult programs, or programs targeted towards adult audiences. So the pros and cons of content analysis. The pros are that it describes what's on. It also helps us identify areas of interest and or concern. So let's say I started off by thinking, well, maybe violence is important for children's cartoons. But then let's say I did a study and I find out, well, guess what? There isn't that much violence in children's cartoons. Well, that would help me point out that, well, maybe this isn't an important component of children's cartoons. So it can help us identify important areas or areas that aren't important. So those are the pros. The cons, it kind of provides us with an incomplete picture. You know basically what was coded for based on the definitions of the coding procedure, which are published if papers are published, but you don't know what wasn't coded for. So maybe they coded for the wrong things. You don't know. Also, you don't have any evidence of effects whatsoever. So you can't say that violence causes problems based on a content analysis alone. You have to do other types of research. Now, one specific type of research that's designed to tell us about cause are experiments. They're specifically designed to assess causal relationships. So we can answer the with what effect question from that longer question before. Now, cause is specifically defined in a way for science, and it has three criteria that must be met. Now, the three criteria are correlation. That basically means as one thing is changing, the other thing is changing as well. So let's say we have two variables. We have time of year, and we also have ice cream sales. Now, we know that time of year and ice cream sales are correlated, right? So, for example, in the summer, people sell more ice cream than they sell in the winter. So that's an example of correlation. As time increases towards summer, ice cream sales also increase. There also has to be time order. So going back to our ice cream sales, does warmer weather cause people to buy more ice cream? Well, you have to demonstrate that the warmer weather happens prior to the ice cream sales. So time order basically means that the cause precedes the effect. So the cause has to happen before the effect, because otherwise it doesn't make sense, right? You can't have an effect that happens before the cause. And then lastly, there can't be a third variable in the situation. Now, going back to that example I just gave you, this is kind of a classic example of a third variable. So let's say that we know that, here's another correlation that actually happens. Ice cream sales and murder rates are correlated. And this is typically used as an example of a third variable cause. We know that ice cream sales and murder rates are correlated, so does that mean that ice cream sales cause murders to happen? Well, no, because there's a third variable cause there, which is the temperature outside. As the temperature increases, more people get outside, which provides more opportunities for conflicts to happen between individuals, which leads to more murders being committed, but it also leads to more ice cream sales being sold. So even though ice cream sales and murder rate are correlated, that doesn't mean that one is causing the other, because there tends to be a third variable cause in there. So again, the three criteria for causality are correlation, time order, and no third variable cause. Now, the major characteristics of experiments are random assignment to experimental conditions. What this means is that you take one sample of individuals that you're interested in, and then you choose half of those individuals randomly to experience the experimental manipulation, and you choose the other half to experience the control situation, or the lack of the manipulation. This is how medical research is done. So they take a number of people who are suffering from the same illness, they assign half of them to receive some kind of experimental drug, and then the other half receives a placebo or a sugar pill. They're manipulating the key variable there, which is whether or not you're getting the drug or whether or not you're not getting the drug. So manipulation is also a major characteristic of experiment. And that basically just means selecting selecting what the intervention is going to be. So selecting what the drug is going to be. You're manipulating that. Here's an example related to media research. So on the left side of the screen here we have a behavior, and we're measuring how much that behavior happens in each individual in our sample. Then we randomly assign half of our sample to be exposed to a PSA, a public service announcement, and then we choose the other half to be randomly assigned to the condition that doesn't receive a PSA exposure. Now afterwards, we can measure their behavior again and see if there was any change. So we're looking for a difference here, right? After exposure, is their behavior different? And if we find that the people in the manipulation, the people who are exposed to the PSA, their behavior changes positively, and then the people who were exposed to nothing, their behavior doesn't change, we can say that our manipulation or exposure to the PSA had some effect on behavior. So experiments, some pros for those. They're good for establishing causality. In addition, they also allow the researcher to have a lot of control over a situation, so they can control external influences. Remember those third variable causes. They're relatively inexpensive. They're much cheaper than going out into the field and trying to conduct research. And they're also very easy for others to replicate. Now, one of the big things about science is that we don't care about any one specific finding. We only care if findings replicate. So we want to be able to see the same thing happen again and again in the same situations. Otherwise, we might just think it's some kind of idiosyncratic effect that only happens once, or that maybe we had a mistake somewhere in our experiment, or we had some kind of fault that led us to find something wrong. So we want to be able to see those replications, and experiments allow for easy replication. Cons: artificial surroundings can affect a participant's behavior. So when you're in an experiment, you're not in your natural surrounding, and those artificial surroundings could affect your behavior in a specific way. Now, this is kind of a weak criticism to experiments overall, due to the fact that, well, that's actually based on what kind of questions you're asking and what you're researching. But generally, people point out the artificial nature of experiments as being a problem, and that's not always the case, because it's only a problem if the artificial nature influences participants in a specific way. And with random assignment and other components and other safeguards that are done, it's unlikely for that to have a strong effect. In addition, another con is experimental bias. So if participants know which condition they are in, they could act in a way that helps confirm or helps disconfirm the researcher's hypothesis. So it's important for participants not to realize which condition they're in, and it's also important for researchers not to realize which condition people are in, so that they don't accidentally influence their responses. Field experiments are just like regular experiments, except sometimes they don't have random assignment to conditions. So sometimes it's not allowed or it's not ethical to randomly assign people to conditions. So participants are studied with field experiments, though, in their real-life settings, so it allows for more ecological validity. It's more close to real life. The behaviors tend to be more natural than in laboratory experiments, so that's another pro here. However, the cons: it doesn't allow for much physical control, so you don't have as much control in a field experiment as you do in a laboratory experiment. In addition, it could raise ethical issues. So let's say you're researching management styles and which management style is best. Well, if you randomly assign people to different managers, you could be giving people an advantage in their real life that they shouldn't have, or you could be handicapping people in their real life in a way that is detrimental to them and their future employment opportunities. So those can raise ethical issues that you have to be concerned about with field experiments. Now, the next form of research that's typically conducted with mass communication research are surveys. Surveys allow us to assess measurable characteristics of a naturally occurring population. And they have two goals. One, to describe the characteristics of the population. So this first one basically means, we're trying to describe some characteristic of a population. So maybe we're interested in what is the average height of a population. That's a characteristic of that population. But for an example, for media usage, maybe we're curious how concerned people are about the amount of violence depicted in movies, TV shows, and popular music. So we can ask people, are you very concerned, fairly concerned, not very concerned, or not at all concerned? And based on this, we can come up with an average of how concerned people are within a specific population. So that's one goal of surveys, to describe a population. The other goal is to establish associations or relationships between variables within the population. So maybe we're curious, in addition to how concerned people are about violence in TVs, movies, and popular music, maybe we're also curious as to whether or not they support censorship of media. We could ask that question, and then we could look at what type of relationship occurs between how concerned they are and whether or not they support censorship. So there could be a positive relationship. As their level of concern increases, they're also more likely to support censorship. Or there could be a negative relationship. As their concern increases, their likelihood of supporting censorship decreases. So here are these two relationships on this chart, right? So X and Y. On the left, we have a positive relationship. As X increases, Y also increases in value. So you can see that 3 on the left is associated with a value of 1 on y. 5x has an association of 2 on y. So you can see as x increases, y is also increasing. Now on the chart on the right, you see that as x increases, w decreases. That's a negative relationship. So if we're going back to that question, we know that as concern for media and violence goes, that also increases with concern for or support of censorship. So that would be a positive relationship between support of censorship and concern for violent material. But that's what surveys help you do. They help us establish these associations and also describe a population. So survey research, pros, generalizability. So they allow us to generalize to other populations. So that means basically that if we select our samples correctly, we can say something about the population at large. They're also very good at describing populations, so they're really good at being accurate. This is how presidential elections are predicted, and they're very, very good at predicting things like that. Cons, there's little or no evidence of causal relationships with surveys. That's because there can always be a third variable causing the relationship. If you don't control for those third variables in a situation like an experiment, you can't say for sure that they didn't have an effect. Now, longitudinal research is also research that's done in communication. This is where you observe outcomes at more than one point in time. Generally, it's more than 2 points in time as well. So this type of longitudinal research has been done before with, you look at how much children are exposed to violence in the media, and then you look at them when they become adults and see if you see differences in crime rates, right? Whether or not they've been convicted of a violent crime. So that's the type of longitudinal research. You let time elapse, and then you measure people again, and you look for those relationships. This is good at establishing causality, but it suffers from some of the same problems as survey research because there's a lot of third factor causes in there, or third variable causes. Now, longitudinal research falls into 2 different formats. A panel study, where you have the exact same sample at multiple time points. So I track the same person maybe throughout their life and their media research or their media consumption habits. So I have the same people and I'm looking at them at different points in time. And then you have a cohort study. So you observe different samples, but you observe them at multiple points in time. So I randomly select certain people to look at when they're young, and then I randomly select other people when they're older. This allows you to overcome things like testing effects and whatnot if your longitudinal research is done over a shorter period of time. So longitudinal research, pros, you can see change over time, which is really important. You can also help rule out alternative explanations, especially if you have really strong trends in your data. The cons, historical events can shade the longitudinal research so that they interfere with your manipulations. So things like September 11th, right, can have strong impacts on people's views that might wash out or exacerbate any potential experimental manipulation that you worked into your longitudinal study. In addition, selection bias. People who tend to participate in longitudinal research might be different than individuals who aren't willing to take that amount of time. You also have subject mortality, which basically means some subjects will leave your experiment before the experiment is over. If this is a lot of subjects, that could be a problem. Time and cost, they tend to be more expensive than other forms of research. And then lastly, outliers. Maybe the people that you're studying are outliers, right? Maybe they're different from other people. Maybe they're just completely different, and they're so different that you can't find out anything useful from them because they don't represent an average, ordinary person. All right, other forms of research. Meta-analysis is a way of doing research. Basically, this means you systematically integrate the findings from a bunch of empirical studies. Now, this is different from triangulation, which we talked about before, because meta-analysis basically combines just the findings. So let's say, for example, there were 100 surveys that were done over a 10-year period. Now, each one of those surveys is looking at, let's say, media violence and aggression. Now, some of those surveys find really large correlations, right, maybe around 0.7, but some of those surveys only find correlations around 0.1. The reason for that is you're going to have some variance in those correlations just naturally because of the way statistics are calculated. Now, meta-analysis allows you to combine all those different correlations into one average correlation. And that's used to provide a bigger picture of what's the average effect. This is used in, or has been used in video game research, looking at violence, and it shows that the effect is very small. It's been used in other forms of research. But this basically allows you to combine and look at the findings in a specific way and to provide a kind of bigger, broader picture. Now, just as an example of how this differs from triangulation, in triangulation, multiple methodologies are used. So whereas before with meta-analysis, you're combining the findings from basically one type of methodology. You can't combine the findings from different types. With triangulation, you're using different methods to look at the same question. With triangulation, also, the combined results are more compelling than any single methodology, right? So if you are finding significant positive correlations looking at experiments, and you're seeing the same correlations in surveys, and you're seeing the same, and you're seeing lots of evidence for it in content analysis, or you're seeing lots of that content in content analysis, that allows you for more compelling results than just one of those studies alone. And they typically increase credibility. Here's just a quick slide to demonstrate how triangulation can help you figure out where you are, right? If you know where the ocean is, you kind of have an idea of where you are on the map. But if you also know where the ocean and the pool are, you have a better idea of where you are on the map, right? And if you also know where the bar is compared to the pool and the ocean, you have a great idea of where you've passed out on the map. All right. Now, we conduct research to describe content, that's content analysis, to describe media usage, that's surveys, to establish media effects, those are experiments and longitudinal studies, and to combine our research efforts for better results, those are meta-analysis and triangulation. Now that brings us to the end of the slideshow. The next two lectures are going to be not done by me, they're going to be lectures from the course when it's done during the regular semester, so they might be a little bit longer, but they'll be on the audience concept and also on uses and gratifications research.